Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. So Mark Sisson needs little introduction, but in summary, he's the best-selling author of the Primal Blueprint, a former world-class endurance athlete and one of the leading voices of the Evolutionary Health Movement. His blog, marksdailyapple.com, has paved the way for primal enthusiasts to challenge conventional wisdom's diet and exercise principles and take personal responsibility for their health and well-being. Today, we're lucky to have Mark on the show to help us really understand the keto diet that everyone is talking about, but not quite understanding, I believe. So firstly, Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Excellent. Look, I'm really excited to talk to you about the keto diet. One, because everyone's talking about it and maybe a lot of people don't really know much about it. And I guess the other reason is your book is being released soon in the fall, and I really wanted to get people to know about the book. And I think that's a really good way for them to learn about it and learn your experience with it. So many of our listeners obviously are familiar with the keto diet, but can you give us a bit of a definition, a brief explanation perhaps, of the difference between, say, a low carb versus a keto diet in terms of maybe macro percentages and anything else you think is relevant?
Sure. I think we initially take the position that the less glucose we burn in a lifetime, the better off we are. Perhaps the longer we live, perhaps the less ill we get. So if we can reduce our intake of sugar and our combustion of glucose substantially from where it has been with the standard American diet, and I'm sure the standard Australian diet. And we look at ways in which we can maximize fat burning. So if you decrease the amount of glucose you burn, you of necessity want to increase the amount of fat you burn. The position we take is that humans are basically fat-burning beasts. We're born with this amazing set of genes that wants us to be good at burning fat, but unfortunately we get a little bit led astray early on with all the available high carbohydrate foods. So the low carb diet in general is an attempt to structure a way of eating where you reduce the amount of carbohydrate, particularly processed carbohydrate, and sugar in your diet to get to that first level of getting rid of sugar and of learning how to become good at burning fat. And a lot of people have taken on a low carbohydrate eating strategy. It is sort of the default setting for anybody who claims to be paleo or primal or ancestral. And you get there, by the way, just by simply cutting out sugars, cutting out sweetened beverages, cutting out desserts, pies, cookies, cakes, you call them biscuits, and all the other things that we know we shouldn't be eating. And you're left with vegetables and fruits and some tubers and maybe some forms of non-offensive grains, quinoa, things like that, maybe the occasional legume. And what we find is that over time, people reduce the amount of carbs you're taking in from 350 grams or 500 grams a day down to 100, 150 grams a day simply by getting rid of those clearly offensive forms of sugar-laden carbohydrates. So the first level of accomplishment I would suggest is when you become low carb and you keep that range in what we call, the maintenance area of 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day. In that range, you have become better at burning fat. You've become less dependent on carbohydrates, but you're taking in enough carbohydrates that you're never on that roller coaster of blood glucose or blood sugar. Now, when we look at the keto diet is simply a way of getting to the next level, of becoming even better at burning fat and becoming even less dependent on glucose than you were before. Because the body has a remarkable way of adapting to a lack of carbohydrate by increasing the amount of mitochondria that we make, that our cells make, and by increasing the efficiency of those mitochondria in burning fat. And then something kicks in, which is quite marvelous. It's almost like a superpower. If you restrict carbohydrate enough, the body gets the signal that we need to change around some of the ways in which we metabolize fuels. And as a result of the restriction of carbohydrate, some of the fats in your liver get converted into these ketone bodies. They are a normal, healthy sort of fuel. We call them the fourth fuel. And ketones are burned by the striated muscle, that is skeletal muscle, by cardiac muscle, your heart. They're preferred by the brain. And over time, when you get into this ketogenic way of eating, you unburden yourself of having to take in much glucose at all. And so in terms of macros, we'd now be looking at people taking in anywhere from 5 or 10 grams, which is a really, really low amount of carbohydrate, to 30, 40, maybe 50 grams of carbohydrate a day. In that state of reduced carbohydrate, even down from the 100 to 150 I was talking about before on just a low carb, in that state, you start to upregulate these enzyme systems. We call it mitochondrial biogenesis. You build more mitochondria in the muscle. The mitochondria are where the fat actually burns and where the ketones burn. So the more of these mitochondria you have, the more fat you can put through, and the more fat you can put through and derive energy from that fat, the less reliant you are on carbohydrates. And so you don't have to eat as often as people do in the standard and the SAD. Is that a good enough explanation to open the conversation with?
That is great. And so just to reconfirm then, so we build more mitochondria, and presumably the more keto we become, the more fat it actually converts into keto bodies. Do you have any, I guess, indication of what percentage that might become, the fat actually converted to keto bodies?
Well, yeah. So here's the interesting thing about that. The manufacturing of ketone bodies over time, as the body gets used to it and gets into it, in some cases may decrease to the extent that the body only makes what it needs. So it varies from individual to individual. A lot of times people who enter into ketosis in the initial stages, the people who are first getting into ketosis and who are doing the glucose monitoring and the ketone monitoring in their blood, the blood strips, are like, oh, look at me, I'm 4 millimolar and I'm 5 millimolar, I'm 6 millimolar. Part of that is it's like you're a newbie. You're new to ketosis, and the body's making ketones all over the place, but doesn't know how to burn them yet. Hasn't built the metabolic machinery to burn the ketones. And so you spill them out in the urine. They show up in the bloodstream. You breathe them out in your breath, which is noticeable on a lot of people who are early into ketosis. But over time, as you become more and more in ketosis, the body starts to self-regulate. The body goes, I don't need to make that many ketones. I've built the machinery. I know exactly how much to make. And so there isn't really, like a percentage that we can look at. It varies with the individual. It varies over time. Again, we come back to this elegant design that the human body has, which over time does kind of create a form of ketone homeostasis, where the body makes enough ketones to provide the energy to fuel the brain and fuel whatever activities you're engaging in that might require slightly higher effort than, say, just burning fat walking around.
Got you. Excellent. So can you give us a bit of an outline about the main benefits as to why, like an endurance athlete, which is many of our listeners, how they would benefit from a keto diet?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just be clear that when I wrote about the ketogenic diet, and my book is called the Keto Reset Diet, and it's literally about how to reset your metabolism, because what I'm after isn't necessarily to be, fantastic at burning ketones for the rest of my life. Yes, I want that. But what I'm really after, the end goal, is what we call metabolic flexibility. I want to be good at burning all fuels without creating a lot of free radical fallout. I want to be able to burn all fuels according to how I'm consuming them. So if I do go off the wagon and start consuming, a dessert or something like that, I don't feel terrible as a result of that. I want this kind of metabolic flexibility where I can burn glucose efficiently if that's what's available. I can burn fats. I can create and burn ketones. So I look at ketosis and the keto diet as a strategy, as a tool to improve my metabolic flexibility. And in my book, I talk about a process by which you get to the point where you start a 6-week program of being in ketosis. Now, if you stay in ketosis for months after that or years after that, that's up to you. But what I've seen happen so often is that period of time in ketosis upregulates all these enzyme systems, improves the mitochondrial biogenesis, increases the number of mitochondria. It also improves the efficiency of the mitochondria that you already have, so they become more efficient at burning fat. And to the extent that when you decide, well, I'm going to start eating more carbs, I'm out of ketosis, you keep that metabolic machinery, you still become better at burning fat. So what does that mean to an endurance athlete? Well, what that means is, let's just say that you can go at 80% of your max now, burning 60% fat and 40% glucose glycogen, which is kind of a normal thing at, say, 80% of your max output. Well, what if we could train you to where at 80% of your max output, you were deriving 92% of all your energy needs from fat and only requiring 8% carbs? Well, what that would mean is that you wouldn't deplete the minimal glycogen reserves that you have in your muscles, that you wouldn't be drawing on that liver glycogen that's keeping your brain fueled and happy and enthusiastic about the race you're doing. So we train ourselves to become better and better at burning fat, because the higher output that we can generate and still get most of our energy from fat, the less it taps into our glycogen reserves. And it's still, a fact in high-end athletic output that when you do run out of glycogen, it becomes much more difficult to maintain that pace. We've all referred to it as bonking or hitting the wall over the years. So what we're trying to do is just improve your metabolic efficiency. We're trying to create a fuel partitioning that draws heavily upon fats and is less reliant upon not only the stored carbohydrate in the glycogen that's in the muscle cells, but also less reliant on taking in those gel packs and those carbohydrate supplements, which over a course of a couple of hours in an endurance contest almost invariably cause some sort of gastric upset.
And what about minimizing risk of disease?
Well, so you asked about an athlete, and that's the main reason I'd have an endurance athlete engage in some form of ketogenic dieting during the season or during the off season. But then we look at the other benefits of the ketogenic diet, one of which is that it seems to, again, the less glucose you put through your body, the fewer these advanced glycated end products you're going to create, which are a marker of not only aging, but of cardiovascular disease and things like that. So you're going to decrease your risk for some of the cardiovascular issues. We see within the ketogenic field, people are burning off stored body fat. They basically trend toward their ideal body composition. So as you become good at burning fat, every meal you skip, whether intentionally or just accidentally, the body takes those calories from your hips, your thighs, your, any adipose tissue. And of course, reducing body fat up to a point is a good thing for most people. Now, one of the more interesting things about the ketogenic diet, sorry, I'm so excited, I'm taking a sip of water here. It has indications of an anti-aging benefit. So imagine you are a cell in the body, and cells tend to divide over time. That's how we grow. That's how we continue to live. As cells get old and die, or as they're close to getting to that point, they divide, they split in two, they create new cells. And then the new cells take off, and they have, telomeres within that determine how many cell divisions are going to happen within a lifetime. Well, imagine a cell in the human body that's surrounded by all sorts of nutrients, particularly glucose. And the cell is going, wow, this is crazy. There's plenty of food around. I'm going to divide because there's plenty of resources for me to divide. And since ultimately the end result of evolution is so that we can pass the genetic material along to the next generation, much of evolution is driven toward just an organism reaching maturity and passing along that genetic material so another organism can be made. So now a cell, in the face of all of this great nutrition, would say, we'll divide. There's no reason not to. There's plenty of food for everybody. Let's have a good time. Meanwhile, a cell that is faced with minimal amounts of external nutrition, particularly less and less glucose, is going to be inclined to go, there's not a lot of food around, certainly not a lot of glucose. This would be the worst time to divide. This would be the worst time to make two of myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inward, and I'm going to start to look for some of the things that I could scavenge within myself. I'm going to consume damaged proteins and damaged fats. I'm going to repair some of the DNA. And so one of the things that happens as a result of long-term ketosis, and is certainly a major benefit of intermittent fasting or even prolonged fasting, there's points of relative similarity between the two, is that there's this tendency for the cells to repair themselves and become healthier and get rid of any sort of, precancerous proclivities. A lot of that's still theoretical, but that's what's being looked at in the science right now, is if we can create an environment where the cells are not so inundated with nutrition all the time and a meal every 2.5 hours, the way so much of the health and fitness industry has been espousing for the last several decades. And instead, look at how we can become much more efficient and actually rely on less fuel over time. And that's, again, one of the great benefits of the ketogenic diet is hunger dissipates. You don't get hungry as often. I don't know if you've had that experience yourself, but it's a pretty profound feeling to eat a meal and have enough to satisfy and then push the plate away and go, you know what, that's great. Every bite of that meal was awesome, but I don't need to eat again for a long time. Whereas most people today, they finish lunch and they go, okay, that's great. What's for dinner? So there's an empowerment that happens as a result of training your body to become more efficient at burning fat and becoming better at manufacturing and utilizing ketones and less reliant on glucose.
Absolutely. And I can definitely relate to that, not feeling hungry. But one thing I'm interested in what you said is you get down to your ideal weight, which I've seen in many clients. But I wondered whether, like in my instance, for example, I can't go on a ketogenic diet for very long because I just lose too much weight. Have you seen that?
Nobody wants to hear that, by the way. Right? Nobody wants to hear that you lose too much weight, Ali. That's just the way it is.
No, but I wonder if that's quite common with some clients that you've seen as well.
Well, some people lose what you would call too much weight. Some people don't lose as much as they want. And let me remind you that ideal body composition isn't what you think, isn't the picture that you're trying to recreate because you saw it on the cover of a fitness magazine. Your ideal body composition is where your body says, I got all the energy I want. I got all the lean mass I need to be powerful and strong and lean. I don't get sick. And most importantly, I don't get hungry. I like where I am. That's your ideal body composition. So we can't artificially arrive at an ideal body composition. Like if you get into a ketogenic eating strategy, clearly you're good at burning fat. Clearly you've got a handle on your appetite. The only caveat I would say, and it's a great one. Yeah, I have a friend who's been in ketosis for 5 years and eats one meal a day. He eats dinner. And I went to him and I said, oh, geez, one meal a day. I'm not sure that I would do that. I actually like food too much. But he said, no. I've got, I work out. I'm strong. I've got a business I'm running. I'm busy. I'm not hungry. I eat one meal a day. I just have to be mindful. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you have to be mindful that you don't overeat, right? And he goes, no. I have to be mindful that I eat enough because that's how much my hunger dissipates because I'm energetic all day long. I just don't feel the need to be consuming all this food. So you might think, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you can become efficient at how you burn calories, and if you can become less reliant on having to eat a ton of calories every day and still maintain energy and still have the guy even puts on muscle mass. He goes to the gym and he does train. But to discover that you can be truly effective and efficient consuming, say, 30 or 40% fewer calories than when you were eating a high carb diet, wouldn't that be a good thing, right? But a lot of people come to me and they say, because it's kind of interesting how this world operates. People go, I'll see people who run marathons and 10Ks. I go, well, why do you run so much? Do you love to run? They go, well, no, not really. I like to eat. I went, wait a minute. You are putting yourself through all this misery on the road. You don't even enjoy it that much, but you're doing it because you want to eat a few more bites of something you probably shouldn't have eaten in the first place? Do you see how ridiculous that is? People tend to I'm going to use the term gluttony, as a driving force for all the work that they're doing in the gym. We call it exercise anorexia. I mean, it's a weird kind of thing. It's like the world operates on this new paradigm, at least the first to develop world, which is what's the most amount of food I can eat and not gain weight, right?
So
how many people, you know what I mean? How many people do that? Like, I want to eat as much as I can and not gain weight. And that just leads to some people can get away with it for a while. I mean, I was the biggest eater in the university I went to. I weighed 145 pounds. I could eat more than any football player. It did not serve me well.
Well, from the outside, you might think they're getting away with it, but are they really?
And they're not from the inside. Exactly. So a couple of years ago, I did this thought experiment and I said, well, that's interesting. I wonder what's the least amount of food I can eat and maintain muscle mass or build muscle mass, maintain energy, never get sick, and most importantly, not be hungry. And it turns out that if you can develop that skill where you don't have to eat that much or that often, and yet every time, believe me, every time I do eat, I enjoy every single bite. I savor every single bite. I don't put anything in my mouth that doesn't taste awesome, right? But I don't overeat anymore. And I don't, it's like that's not part of my constitution anymore because I've become so good at burning fat. I've become so efficient at metabolizing food different way. I become so metabolically efficient that I transcended, that old paradigm of what's the most amount I can eat. Now it's like, what does it take to satisfy me at a meal? Because I know, first of all, I know there's going to be food everywhere I turn if I need food, right? So it's not going to be an issue of starving. I mean, that's one of the reasons people are so inclined to overeat, is because we're wired to overeat because of, 2 million years of human history where most of the time there wasn't a lot of food around. So we're kind of wired to overconsume, especially carbohydrates, because humans are designed to eat. You come across a grove of fruit at the end of the growing season and you're coming up on winter and lean times, you overeat, you put on some fat. That's why fruit converts to fat so beautifully being a relative word here. But, fructose gets converted into triglycerides pretty quickly. So, and that's by design, by evolution. And humans have this ability to store fat. Absolutely. But we have this amazing ability to use fat, to take the stored fat on our bodies and burn it for fuel. And then in the absence of new sources of glucose, more sugar, in the absence of fruit, historically and evolutionarily, to create a substitute fuel, ketones, to fuel the brain and keep us not just energetic and able to continue moving about the day, but also keep our mood elevated and keep us feeling positive and, all the things that we need in the face. Because imagine a hunter-gatherer who goes a couple of days without food and then, finds an animal, tracks the animal, and doesn't kill the animal. Now you've gone, 5 days without food, and yet to have that ability to continue to maintain, a positive attitude in the face of that sort of a defeat was critical to our survival. So it translates to not only everything in modern life today, but if you then think in terms of back to competition and athletic competition, you're 60 miles into a 100-mile road race. And now that you're really good at burning fat, and now that you've unburdened yourself of needing to take in glucose to keep the brain from wanting to pull over the side of the road and take a nap, now that you've become so good at generating ketones, and now that the brain thrives on ketones, now the brain is in a position to keep you motoring along. Whereas in the old paradigm of taking in sugar and carbohydrate and then depleting them, the brain with low glucose and no real adaptation of burning ketones, the brain would just go, nah, I'm pulling over, time, I'm out of the race. Tim Noakes referred to it a long time ago as the central governor theory of the brain, which was that it's the brain. You don't really hit the wall because of a lack of glycogen in the muscles of the legs in a marathon. Certainly you run that reserve way down, but you never completely deplete the glycogen reserves. Long before that happens, the brain gets so low in blood sugar that the brain says, danger, danger, danger. There's a possibility that we could hurt ourselves. So let's pull over the side of the road and take a nap. And that's why people drop out of races. So that was all this sort of sugar dependency, this carbohydrate dependency, this tendency to create sports supplements that allowed you to take in more sugar every 15 minutes for hours at a time, that just got put forth and then advanced and then became the standard operating procedure for most athletes for decades. This has all changed. Go ahead. Sorry.
So, yeah, just on that note, Mark, I'd love to ask you this question because I've got a lot of athletes who like to say, I'm going on a keto diet and I'm going to be strict on this diet. And obviously they're training for a big event. They go into the event and they maintain that they're on a keto diet. And so they try and remain keto through the race. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, depending on the distance of the race, that's entirely appropriate and possible, remaining keto during the race.
So let's say it's an Ironman.
Yeah. So an Ironman, you've got some swimming, you've got some cycling with changes of terrain. So you might go slightly glycolytic. But what I'm seeing with a lot of ketogenic Ironman athletes is you start out ketogenic. So you're supplementing with nut butters and a little bit of MCT oil, if you can take that, and those sorts of readily available fats that would literally, shore up your energy reserves. And then as the race goes on, if you get to the point where you start to feel woozy, it's appropriate to take in a little bit of glucose. But now there are some, what they call superstarches, some very, very low glycemic index glucose products. UCAN makes one that you can take, and it doesn't mess with anything else that's going on in your system. You're not getting yourself out of ketosis. So you're still in ketosis, but you've got a little bit of glucose that's available. So now you're really taking advantage of what we call that fuel partitioning. You're deriving most of your energy from fat, some of your brain fuel from ketones, and then making the difference up with a little bit of glucose.
Okay. And what about like a stage race? What about the Tour de France?
Well, those guys, we start to hit a point where you're going glycolytic so hard. I mean, those guys are putting out so much wattage during some of the time trials and certainly some of the sprints at the end and some of the hill climbs that you got to have to look at them slightly different and think, okay, if they trained ketogenically and then sort of went hybrid in a race, because training ketogenically still gives you that ability to go if you could go at 90% of your max output, and whereas normally you'd be 50-50 carbs and glucose and fat, and now you're 80% fat and 20% or 90% fat and 10% carbs, that's always going to benefit you more than the guy riding right next to you who's now still reliant so much on the carbohydrates. You'd look at these stage racers and you go, okay, then you're going to want to carb load a little bit at the end of the race, not 500 grams of a glucose solution, but maybe a sweet potato or a baked potato that night, top off the glycogen reserves, because it's quite unusual, because then you have to hit it hard again the next day. And then there's a lot of work that we can do. I wrote a book a year ago called Primal Endurance. And in that book, we talk a lot about the methods of training to get to that point. And one of those methods of training would involve work in the gym, where you're doing what we call maximum overload work, where you're loading the leg fibers deeper and deeper by doing heavy weights, not light weights and high repetitions, but heavy weights, even as a cyclist, and then training for what we call maximum sustained power. And that maximum sustained power is that ability to go over the first hill at 100% and then go over the next hill at 97% and go over the last hill at 92%. Because of your training and because of your fuel partitioning and the combination of all these things. At the elite level and stage racing, it gets very complex. But for purposes of just talking about doing an Ironman as an age grouper or doing a 50-miler or a 100-mile race, those are clearly benefiting from ketogenic training and eating.
Have you ever seen a detrimental effect where someone's training quite hard, long distance endurance sessions with HIIT sessions, and then I guess get some sort of thyroid or hormonal imbalance because they were on a ketogenic diet?
Yes. And I've seen it also because they were on a high carb diet. Part of that's just the being smart about how you orchestrate and put together your training schedule. I think that, as I spell out in my book, Primal Endurance, so much of your training has to happen at a heart rate that is the max aerobic heart rate, which is generally a lot lower than most athletes think it is. So most athletes train in a no man's land where the heart rate is too high to be burning fat, so you're continuously glycolytic, but too low to be considered HIIT or interval training. And yet most of the time is spent in that zone. So we caution cyclists, for instance, and runners to train at 180 minus your age. And do most of your training in that range, which for some people is like ridiculously slower than what they're used to. But what they find is that over time, that they can, because they're good at burning fat, and they become better at burning fat. I'll give you an example. So some guy could run 630 miles for training pretty easily, but his heart rate was fairly high. It was up in the 75 to 80% range. But he could do it for hours at a time in training. And then, so 630 miles isn't bad for training, but now you restrict his heart rate to, you can't exceed 180 minus your age. And so now he finds that if he stays in that zone, he's only able to do 8.5 minute miles. Because if he goes any faster than 8.5 minute miles, his heart rate exceeds the prescribed amount. So then he's like, okay, wait a minute, this is way too slow. I'm not getting anything done. Well, what you're doing is you're running as fast as you can, burning mostly fat. And that's what the process is. And over time, if you hold to that heart rate, you find that the amount of speed that you can generate picks up. And all of a sudden, a couple of weeks or months into it, you're running, instead of 8.5 minute miles, you're running 7.5 minute miles, and then 7 minute miles. And then you're back to running 630s again. But now you're doing it where you're getting most of your energy from fat and very little reliant on carbohydrates. we could do a whole, no, not just a podcast. We could do a whole year on putting together a training program that would maximize all these different systems.
Well, we'll put a link. We'll put a link to Primal
Yeah.
Endurance in the show notes, and I recommend all our listeners look at that definitely.
Yep.
And I know you go into detail there. I'd love to ask you a bit more about the benefits of keto in terms of treating diseases and the proof around that. I know the recent article that you sent me that just came out regarding MS. And then obviously there's a lot of research around diabetes and cancer. Can you give us your sort of research around that?
I pull up studies like everyone else does. I don't do a lot of research around the medical aspect because I'm so enthralled with the athletic benefits. But I'll tell you that, the primary use of the ketogenic diet in the last 3 decades has been around people with epilepsy, particularly children who have multiple seizures, whose brains function so well on a ketogenic diet that the seizures quite often completely disappear. There's an organization in the U.S. called the Charlie Foundation. It was basically named after this child whose name was Charlie, who was having up to 300 seizures a day, and the parents were beside themselves, clearly, as you would be. They discovered the ketogenic eating strategy for their child, who went from 300 seizures a day to none. And it was so profound. They thought that Charlie was going to be disabled or not live long enough to even be disabled. And he's a healthy, functioning young man today. So there's tens of thousands of people that are using a ketogenic diet for that application. I sent you a link. One of the concerns about the ketogenic diet is there's not enough fiber to feed a healthy gut biome. Well, that was dispelled recently in a study that showed that there's a way to do a ketogenic diet that improves the gut biome. And we know now that so much of disease conditions are negatively impacted by an unhealthy gut biome. So having a healthy gut biome is a good thing. And I will tell you that when I'm in ketosis, I'm still eating a fair amount of vegetables. I'm probably eating more vegetables than the average person on the standard American diet. I will have a big bowl of lettuce, cucumbers, some bell peppers, some avocado, a couple of strips of bacon, and I'll douse it with one of my avocado oil-based salad dressings. And I'll wind up having a meal that has mostly healthy fats, a little bit of protein, and a tiny bit, maybe 15 grams total, maybe 20, of slow-burning carbohydrate. That is a perfectly designed ketogenic meal and contains a lot of fiber within the vegetables for my gut biome. So that myth has been quickly dispelled about the ketogenic diet and dysbiosis. I think the problem comes because so many, from the Atkins days, people were trying to go into ketosis eating just crappy foods, just eating unhealthy fat, trans fats, hydrogenated oils, manufactured foods, things like that. So I think once you get rid of that, everything is copacetic.
And I think Dr. Michael Roscoe made a good point on a recent podcast with Ben Greenfield. He basically concludes that everyone requires different amounts of carbs for a healthy microbiota anyway. So you can't just say, here's the number and let's all meet this number. It's totally independent.
Everyone's microbiome is distinct and different as your fingerprint is from one person to the next. So to start to prescribe diets based around someone else's healthy gut biome is just that's going down the wrong path, I think. And yet it does point out that ultimately this comes down to how do you feel? You can do all the testing in the world. You can get your gut biome tested. You can do you can have your blood panels done. You can have your A1C and your fasting glucose and your fasting insulin and all these markers. But ultimately, how do you feel?
I like that you say that. And actually, your last blog that you wrote was very interesting to me. It was about measuring things and the inconsistency of different devices, which I can totally relate to. And I think an example you gave was measuring glucose and how 3 different devices gave 3 totally different numbers. And so,
well, I mean, when we say totally different, it was like, whoa, 2 of them were out of the range, one on the low end and one on the high end. So, and this is my writing partner, Brad. And he did this a couple of weeks ago. The same finger prick blood sample yielded a blood glucose of, I think, 75 at the low end. And then I forget what the middle number is, 95 or something, then 125 on the high end. That is such a huge swing in measurements that based on that, you could either say that someone was pre-diabetic or was hypoglycemic. And it was just ridiculous. But back to the whole thing about diabetics, I firmly believe that some sort of a ketogenic approach is the best approach for someone who's a type 2 diabetic. Now, that's not to say you should embark on that lightly, because there are some issues that need to be overcome there. But we do know that, that sort of eating strategy of decreasing blood sugar by decreasing carbohydrate and improving insulin sensitivity and burning off stored body fat, all of that tends to alleviate, if not cure, the blood sugar condition we know as type 2 diabetes.
Yes. You mentioned Brad there, and I remember Brad telling his stories about when he first tried keto and how difficult it was. And I've seen people struggle and fail with a keto diet. They basically jump straight from a SAD diet, like a typical American or Australian diet, Western diet, into a keto diet overnight. And I love how in your book, your approach is do the 21 days, reset, to do that, 150 or slightly less carbs a day, and then some intermittent fasting, and then your 6-week nutritional ketosis period, which I love that approach. Can you tell us a bit more about how that approach works?
Sure. Well, a lot of people are coming from taking in 300 to 500 grams of carbs a day. So just getting them down to 150 is a huge leap. I think it's probably inappropriate to get them down to ketogenic ranges early on. So we take 21 days to kind of reset the metabolism, to get the body used to burning fats, to get the body less reliant on a regular supply of excess glucose every couple of hours. And within that 21 days, people feel really quite good. Then we have, in the middle of the book, we have a midterm exam, we call it. And we don't test blood. Again, we're not doing these tests because we just don't think that they're that reliable. What's more reliable is how you feel. So we have a 100-question midterm exam. And if you get a 75 or better, you are ready to graduate into 6 weeks of ketosis. If you don't pass, it doesn't mean you're not paying attention or you're a bad person. It just means you still got some work to do in order to get into ketosis in a way that's comfortable and convenient and will work for you. That's the reason for this midterm exam. Again, it's a kind of a unique way of looking at these eating strategies, but I think it's going to be very effective.
And Mark, a lot of people seem to dabble with ketosis, more to the point they do like a cyclical keto diet every once a year or a couple of times a year. How do you think you will use the keto diet? Like, do you think you'll use a cyclical diet, or do you think you'll stay keto?
Well, so I'm in and out of keto. I'm also very close on the edge all the time. So when I'm out of ketosis, I'm only taking in 100, 110, 120 grams of carbs a day. So I'm not that far away. And all of this, like I said from the beginning, I'm looking at the keto diet as a way of improving my metabolic flexibility. How efficiently do I burn fuel? How do I burn off my stored body fat? How do I prepare myself for this cellular house cleaning? We call it autophagy, where the cells start to consume the damaged parts of itself as a means of house cleaning, as an anti-aging strategy, and as an anti-disease strategy. So how can I get the best of both worlds? So I just spent 2 months in ketosis. Then I went on vacation in Greece. I'm not going to make any apologies for it. I had a nice time in Greece. I had some baklava. I had some stuff that I just was not willing to not eat while I was there. I felt great the whole time. And then I came back and I got into ketosis for a couple of weeks. And now the transition isn't even like, I don't even know how to define it, because I talk to people who've been in ketosis for 10 years, who only consume 30 grams of carbs a day. And when you ask them what their blood ketone levels are, they'll say, 0.4 to 0.7. Well, that's not even defined as ketosis for some physicians. And yet these are people who are so good at producing ketones. Like I said, the body only makes as much as it needs. Doesn't spill it out in urine, the body's very efficient at not wanting to waste calories. That's why we store body fat. That's why excess calories get converted to body fat. The human body does not want to waste calories. It doesn't even want to be inefficient. People talk about, well, I wish I had a fast metabolism so I could burn through a lot of calories. Well, that's just not a good thing. It is if you're trying to eat a lot of food and then burn it off. But for your health and longevity, that's not a good thing. The best thing is to become efficient at using those calories. So you maintain muscle mass, you maintain energy, you don't get hungry, you don't get sick, and you can thrive on slightly fewer calories than other people. This is how we feed the world, I think, is by reducing the inordinate amount of calories everybody takes in, particularly the sugary stuff that people are so craving. And we get back to teaching the body how to become really, really efficient at burning fat, how to become really good at creating ketone bodies and using them instead of requiring glucose. In so doing, have more energy, have clearer thought, and get sick less often and reduce our risk for just about every kind of disease.
Absolutely. And Mark, when is your new book coming out?
So October 3rd, Keto Reset Diet comes out. You can pre-order it on Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, any of the normal book-selling places.
Great. We'll put a link in the show notes for that as well.
Yep. And it's got 100. It has 100 keto-friendly recipes in it as well. So it's basically everything you need to do to go keto.
Excellent. I was going to ask you whether that was an additional book or whether that was included.
That's it.
Excellent. I must say that one of the big things that my clients always say is they love your cookbooks. So I can imagine that this one is the 100 keto-friendly recipes is going to be a very popular one. Mark, look, I'd love to get you back on the show again one day after everyone's read your book, but thank you so much for coming on. And before I let you go, I've just got to ask you one little personal question.
Uh-oh.
Do you, it may or may not be personal, do you have a tattoo?
I don't have a tattoo. Where did that come from?
I like to ask all my guests. I feel like I learn a bit from them. And have you ever considered getting a tattoo?
No. And the reason is I'm one of those people that I'm a risk manager and I like to mitigate risk. Even though I was one of the top cyclists in the country as a triathlete, I stopped riding my bike on the roads about 20 years ago. I just felt like, okay, that's something that is probably too dangerous for me to be doing. If I get hit, that's the way it goes. And yet I'll snowboard because I feel, and I'll play ultimate frisbee, which is a fairly risky event, but I feel like I'm more in control of that. So in terms of a tattoo, it came down to simply something as simple as, what if I don't like it one day? What if I decide now that I want one, but then later on I don't want one. So that's been the holdout for me. I thought about getting a grok tattoo, I have to admit, at some point, but
I thought you might have a hidden one somewhere.
Yeah, no.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing and thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.